Welcome to Delicious Dishes. I'm Chef Jerry, and today we're going to show you how to make pumpkin soup. It is not like pumpkin pie. This is a savory soup, and it can be used easily as an appetizer or even a main course when paired with a good protein and a really nice loaf of either homemade bread or whatever your favorite bread happens to be. Now, pumpkin soup is an extremely simple recipe. The ingredients for the entire thing are laid out here in front of you. We have onion, butter, pumpkin puree, diced tomatoes, canned of course, chicken broth, thyme, whipping cream, nutmeg, salt, pepper, and green onions. The green onions are primarily as a garnish for the end of the dish, so you can omit those if you'd like. Salt, pepper, and nutmeg are to taste. Now, a word about the nutmeg here. Ground nutmeg that you buy down at any one of the stores, something like this, is perfectly fine. Just realize that it's lost much of its power by the time it gets to you on the shelf. And if you're like most folks, you don't use nutmeg in a lot of recipes, so the power and taste of the nutmeg will diminish over time. The best way to do this is to buy a nutmeg grater and whole nutmeg and literally grate it into the soup. Part of that is as a garnish, part of it is during the cooking process, but believe me when I say it's absolutely fantastic when you do that. So, with no further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start moving some ingredients around so we can clear the cutting board and you can see it in action. The very first thing you have to have is an onion. Now this is about a medium-sized onion. I prefer yellow. If you care more for the taste of white onions or Vidalias, please go ahead and feel free to use those. The whole trick here is that you need to dice the onion very, very finely in order to make this work. Why? Because pumpkin soup is a blended soup, as will become readily apparent as we move forward. Now, I've shown this before on a previous cooking show, but let me reiterate basic knife technique 101 here to dice an onion. Dicing an onion is actually fairly simple. Everybody has their own unique way of doing it. I find that cutting off the top of the onion and splitting it in half at the root actually works the best. Going to the trick to dicing an onion and all basic knife techniques is to make sure that you are using a down and through motion like this, keeping your hand curled up, because believe me, I've cut my fingers more than once learning how to do this. And then you just make small cuts into each half of the onion and then cut it this way. I'll demonstrate. And that one's a little large. Then typically, when I want to do a fine dice, I put at least one cut horizontally into the onion half. Then I simply do this. Voila! The onion is diced. We'll dice up the entire onion because pumpkin soup is very onion heavy. That's one of its primary ingredients besides pumpkin. Wow, this is a powerful onion, folks. My eyes are tearing up a little bit. I hope you're not feeling it at home. Got a little of the husk of the onion on it. And as you can see, that works pretty well. Now, typically, if you're following a recipe for pumpkin soup, typically what you need is about a cup of onion here. What we have is probably closer to about a cup and a third. However, because we are making a regular size batch of onion, I will go ahead and cut out just a little bit of that, and we'll set that aside for later. All right, we've got our onion prepared. The next step is to take roughly 2 tablespoons of butter. Why? Well, because what we're going to do is saute these onions. And believe me when I say there is nothing better to saute any kind of food in than regular good old salted butter. Not margarine, not oleo, not cooking oil, although those are nice. But especially when you're doing a soup, and even more especially when you're doing onions and garlic, butter just adds such a nice flavor to everything. We're going to go ahead and get our pot hooked up. You know what? I need just a little bit more butter here on that. We'll get our pot hooked up, and we want to saute these on medium-high heat, or just slightly over medium. First off, you don't want to burn the butter. Secondly, you want to make sure that you are infusing the onions with butter. This is a very long saute, especially for onions. Typically, most onions you just cook until they're translucent or start to turn clear. In this particular case, we're going to cook them until they're very, very soft, about 5 minutes all told, once the butter melts. And let's check and see how that's going. Finally, we have some butter moving here. As soon as the butter's melted, we'll add the onion. Now, just FYI, I got started on pumpkin soup several years ago, many, many, many years ago. I took my family on a cruise ship for my oldest daughter's high school graduation, which was quite some time ago. And we just so happened to go over Thanksgiving week. As part of the Thanksgiving supper, one of the appetizers they had there was Indian pumpkin soup. That was the name of it. And obviously they're referring to the country India, not necessarily Native Americans. It was delightful, although a little thin for my taste. So I started doing some looking around for recipes, and our butter is hot, so we're going to drop the onions on top of it. We're going to turn down the heat a little bit. This is an electric stove. Electric stoves heat differently than gas, which is what I normally use. So we're going to let those onions saute for a little bit. As I was saying, I got started with the Indian pumpkin soup that we had on the cruise ship. It was wonderful, although a bit thin for my taste, and not necessarily seasoned the way I like. So I started looking around for different recipes. I probably tried a half dozen different pumpkin soup recipes. Some of them were cold, which I did not care for, and some of them were hot. The hot ones were pretty good. This one that I struck on, which I will share with you on the screen, this one that I struck on is absolutely fantastic. It's a real family favorite. So I hope you get to enjoy it too. We'll check on our onions right quick because they are, oh yeah, they're infusing nicely. And I am going to add just a little bit more onion to that. My measuring cup eyes don't work quite as well as they used to. All right, while those onions are sauteing, we're going to begin prepping the next part of this. So, the next part, once the onions are sauteed properly, is we add pumpkin puree, 1 can, diced or stewed tomatoes, 1 can, liquid and all, a teaspoon of thyme, and salt and pepper. We also need to add a quart or 4 cups of warmed chicken stock to this. Now, I happen to use this particular type of chicken broth. You can use low sodium or chicken stock if you prefer. Chicken broth happens to be a little less infused with flavor than chicken stock, so if you want to home make it, that's totally fine, or you can buy it in the boxes or cans. It'll work just the same. So we're going to go ahead and heat this right quick. And normally I do this over the stove to control the temperature a little better. For the sake of time today, and honestly about half the time I do it, for the sake of time, I actually will just put it in the microwave. You microwave it at normal heat for about 1 minute and 15 seconds, 1 minute and 30 seconds, depending on your microwave. The point is you don't want this hot, you just want it warm, you just want it warm through. And there we go. While that's happening, I'm going to need to stir those onions a little bit. It's starting to get a little crispy, which is not a bad thing, but you don't want that to happen to all of them. You don't want to brown the onion too much. Don't want caramelization to set in. So I just take my trusty no-cut can opener, and you'll notice it cuts it along the seam, so literally there are no sharp edges for you to cut yourself on. And I'll open these cans up and we'll get started cooking in earnest here in just a second. I'm going to go ahead and add the tomatoes now to drop that temperature just a little bit. Next, I'll add my pumpkin puree. Oh, that's looking pretty nice and smelling great. Oh, this stuff smells so good when you are making it. It really and truly does. Got a little bit of pumpkin left in the can, so we'll dig that out. And there we go. We are in pretty good shape. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add this warm chicken stock to there. You want to add it a little bit at a time. Now, you're probably wondering, why did he need to warm the chicken stock? This is just a soup. Well, it is, but part of the thing is that you don't want to drop the internal temperature that you've gotten everything up to too drastically. So you warm the stock just basically to temper the soup. That's about it. And voila. So the next ingredient that we're going to add is a teaspoon of thyme. Now, once again, thyme is one of those things that people either enjoy the taste of or not necessarily. So feel free to adjust this to taste. I happen to like a little bit more thyme than most people, so it is not unusual for me to add a little bit when it's time to correct the seasoning. And there we go. Just stir that in a little bit there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit, not much, a little bit of salt and pepper. This is the early stages of the soup, and it hasn't matured a whole lot yet. So you don't want to really dunk it full of spices at this point. Getting a little sloppy in my old age, I see. Once it is cooked down a little bit and the flavors start to mature, then you can start correcting the seasoning by adding salt, pepper, thyme, and later on, nutmeg. So right now, I'm just going to take a healthy pinch. That's about a teaspoon of salt right there. And by the way, in case you're wondering, I use kosher salt. This is a fairly readily available item. It cooks wonderfully well because it's nice and flaked, and it has a unique taste to it. However, it does not contain any iodine whatsoever. So you need to be careful in order to keep iodine in your diet. You need to be careful and buy iodized table salt as opposed to free running, and finish your recipes or have that sitting at table so that it can be added. Takes very, very little iodine in your diet to keep you healthy, but you do need a bit of it. And salt is one of those great ways of getting it. And then I'm just going to take maybe a half teaspoon of pepper, not a lot here. Now, if you've ever watched cooking shows, you know what's about to happen. You need to bring this to a slow boil and then return it to simmer. Roughly speaking, it'll take about 20 minutes there for the soup to fully mature. And then we move on to the next step, which is blending the soup and finishing and correcting the seasoning. Meanwhile, I'm going to go ahead and clean my workspace here, because I'm going to prepare the garnish. Okay, the garnish is actually fairly simple. Simply nothing but scallions or green onions. You could potentially substitute even something as big as leeks or small as shallots. The whole trick is that this is either finely minced from the white part, or with green onions, we're going to use just a little bit of the top of the onion to cut as a garnish. Use as much or as little as you want. It does add some flavor, but mostly it's just pretty. Okay, what we're going to do here is we're going to top these. There's portions of this top that are really not very good to use. They get kind of bitter. So what you want are the portions just past where it starts to turn dark green. They're not overly bitter, and they're very, very pretty when you prepare them. Then we're just going to take the roots off. And we're going to peel off sections that are either starting to molt, I guess is the best way to put to word that, but they don't look very nice, and they're frankly a little slimy and hard to deal with. So normally what I do is I just take that and peel it right straight down. Yes, you do lose a little bit of onion that way, and you may have to rewash it a little bit. Looks like there was some dirt up underneath there on this one, so I'll give that a little bit of a wash. But it makes it pretty simple, pretty easy to deal with. And that one's in pretty good shape. So, the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to prepare the green garnish, which is pretty simple. We're just going to set that to the side. Now, there are a bunch of different ways of doing it, and I'll be frank with you, I'm not really skilled enough to make it look super pretty, but the easiest way to do it is to simply take a sharp paring knife and cut it long ways, like that. Roll each half over again and cut it one more time. So as you can tell, this does not take a whole lot of onion top to make your garnish. Makes it very, very pretty. You can actually curl these and lay them on top of the soup. It looks nice, even if people throw it away. Got a little off center there. And we'll throw that piece away. There you go. That's the top garnish. Then you can also, as I said before, then you can also just take part of the white part of the onion and simply slice it. If you want to, you can also mince this, which is actually pretty easy. Let me set my pretty nice garnishes over here, more or less nice, and we'll do a little mincing. As I showed in my last cooking show, there are multiple ways to do a mince. You can even use coarse salt, such as kosher salt, as a grinding agent. In this case, we don't necessarily want it that super fine. All we need is just a little bit of onion that can be sprinkled on the top. We're going to set that aside now, and we're going to check our soup. Oh, that's starting to look very, very nice. It's starting to look really nice. This is where it gets tricky. You need to control your temperature. You really, really don't want this going to a heavy rolling boil. It just, first off, it damages the seasoning in this particular style of soup. I've actually accidentally gotten it to a rolling boil before, and it tastes almost a little burned at that point. So I'm really pretty careful about this, and I am bound and determined We'll taste test it here in just a second. The next step for this, once we do a little seasoning correction, is that we're then going to split this into 3 batches and run it through a blender. Well, why are you going to run it through a blender? Well, that one's fairly easy. You got large chunks of tomato, large chunks of onion, or large-ish chunks of onion in here, and pumpkin soup is supposed to be very, very smooth and a little creamy. It's got a palate feel that is very pleasant when you blend it properly. So let's go ahead and taste test this right quick. That's tasting pretty good. We're going to need to add a little bit, and I do mean a very little bit, of salt and pepper to this. And I'm going to incorporate some nutmeg right now. Not a lot, because nutmeg is a pretty powerful seasoning agent. So let's start with a little pepper here. Now I use coarse ground pepper. You can buy this at virtually any grocery store anymore. I happen to like it better than the stuff that is very, very finely ground. For one thing, it allows me to see how much I've added and adjust my seasoning a little more accurately. And also, it tastes very nearly like fresh cracked pepper. And I love fresh cracked pepper, but I hate taking care of pepper mills. So this is my compromise. Going to add just a little bit of seasoning to it and turn that temperature down just a teeny tiny bit, and then we'll taste test it again. Now, I won't add the salt until the last part. Why? Because one of the things that salt does is it helps bring flavors together. So we'll wait on this until I incorporate some nutmeg. Now I'm going to use a very scientific method to incorporate the nutmeg. I'm going to shake it in there until it smells right. That's smelling pretty good. I wish you guys were here. Oh, this is wonderful. This is wonderful stuff. And I'm going to add just a pinch and a half of pepper, or I'm sorry, a pinch and a half of salt. We put all the pepper in we're going to. I'm going to add that, and then we're going to taste test it again to see where we're at. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. However, it does need just a bit more nutmeg and a bit more salt. Not a lot. So far, I've on this ground nutmeg, I've added probably a half teaspoon to this. Your results are going to vary, so make sure and don't add too much at any one time, and taste test it. Oh, the smell is awesome. What an aroma coming off of this. As soon as we get around to inventing smell-o-vision, you can enjoy it too. All right. We'll taste test it one more time. Ah, there we go. Now we are cooking. So, I'm going to give this maybe another 5 minutes at this simmer that I've got it at, which is kind of a high simmer because of the electric stove. We're going to give that just a few more minutes, and then we're going to go to blending. Now, while we're waiting those last few minutes, are there more complex ways of making pumpkin or other soups that are made from squash? Absolutely. I could have brought in an entire pumpkin, roasted it in the oven. Of course, you remove all the seeds and strings from it, and then you just roast it in the oven and peel the meat out, and that's what you use for the puree. As opposed to the canned puree. You can do the same thing with butternut squash or acorn squash or any other type of gourd vegetable that is edible, and you can make a fantastic soup from it. Now, that having been said, because I'm well known for selecting recipes that are somewhat on the complex side, just for the fun of doing it that way, the long way around. Why don't I do that? Well, simply put, because this is easier. I'm not going to lie. I like an occasional recipe where I don't have to work too hard or think too much about it. In this particular case, this is a never fail recipe that has worked beautifully every time I've done it. So why mess with success? And I'm going to do one more taste test right quick, and then we're going to go to blending. Oh yes, we are exactly where we need to be. So, how do we do the blending? Especially when you do it in 3 batches. Well, typically how I do this is I actually keep a second stock pot or a glass container very, very close to where I'm doing the blending, and the batch that I blended, I pour it into that container until I've got the pot emptied, then I pour everything over there. That's really messy to do and gets more dishes dirty than you need typically, or at least my wife tells me so. So in this case, we're just going to blend, pour it right back into the pot, blend again, pour it right back into the pot. I'm using a very, very simple blender. Any blender will work. I've done this with food processors as well. Works fine. The trick is to have the patience to blend it down, regardless of how many blades you have on the blender or how high the speed is. Blend it down so that you've got a nice smooth mixture, or smooth-ish at any rate. So, the best way to transfer this is to use a standard old ladle. That's about 1/3 of our mixture right there, and obviously I'm going to need to do a little cleanup. Now typically what I do is I just pop this right on the blender bottom here, and I will set this to crush, and I will just literally I'm going to have to use sign language. What I do is I literally just watch this to see if the larger chunks are being reduced to a manageable size. This particular blender also has a pulse feature, which I'll show you right now. Works great, especially if you have a commercial style blender. The pulse setting is fantastic. All right, so first batch done. And as you can tell, that poured in very nicely, which means that we've done a great job blending that first batch. And we'll go ahead and blend the other batches right quick. Wow. Never let me use a ladle in the kitchen because I will get stuff everywhere. Before I begin blending this next batch, let me give you a huge caution on this. I was making pumpkin soup a very long time ago, and my nephew, who was 9, maybe 10 at the time, was assisting me. Now, this blender that we were using was not the nice one with the locking lid that I've got now. It was actually one of those with the pressure fit rubber lid. And I had my nephew running the blender. Unfortunately, he didn't get the lid tight, and then he hit the button, and it shot very, very, very hot soup up into the air and all over him. Fortunately enough, he was not burned badly, but it did scare the living thunder out of both him, his parents, and me. Make sure when you use a blender that the lid is on tight. This is looking really good. Now, because I have such a large blender, we're going to actually just add the last third on top of this and make sure that we get it. Don't do this. I'm a semi-trained professional. Don't try that at home. At any rate, because I have such a large blender vessel, I'm going to go ahead and try adding the remainder of the soup in here and see if we can get a good blend on everything. While I do that, now because I have such a large amount of liquid in here, I'm going to run it on a slightly slower speed. Going to get those last few tomato chunks out of there just to make sure we don't have anything super chunky left in there. Once again, locking our lid down, very important. And we're going to go with blend. That's looking pretty good. So what we're going to do now, we're going to return that to the heat. Oh, we have a beautiful blend on this. Absolutely gorgeous. Okay, I'm going to let that come back up to temperature slightly while I clear the space and clean up my workspace a little bit. We have a few last steps and then we are ready to eat. Looking very good, and we're almost ready for the last step. Now, with pumpkin soup, like many, many other types of soup, they actually improve once they've been refrigerated overnight. However, you need to heat up pumpkin soup pretty slowly. Why? Because it's not just a pureed soup. The last step here, you add cream to the pumpkin soup. That actually does make it so that the soup will burn if you heat it too hot or too quickly. So let's go ahead and get our heavy whipping cream. Now, this recipe, as it stands right now, calls for roughly half a cup of heavy whipping cream. Obviously, when you add a cold liquid, or this one is nearly room temperature, when you add it back in, you are going to lose a little bit of temper on the soup. That's absolutely true. So you can turn the heat up slightly, not a whole lot, because once again, easy to burn the cream. And we're going to taste test this one more time and correct the seasoning again. Oh, that is very satisfying. I'm going to add a little nutmeg and salt. I think we're sufficient on pepper on this one. I'm going to add a little bit of nutmeg and salt to it to complete it, because we've added another liquid ingredient, so it's going to take some of the seasoning back out. We're just going to bring it back where we want it. Once again, the scientific method of doing it until it smells right. Well, I'll tell you what, this stove is hard to control. Oh, that smells pretty good. Going to finish it off with a little salt. A good healthy pinch ought to do the trick. And we'll just add a little bit extra for luck. Now, at this point, once the pumpkin soup is totally warmed through, you're ready to serve. We'll garnish it with just a teeny tiny bit of that minced scallion, a quick dash of nutmeg. Like I said, boy, if you can do this with fresh ground nutmeg, oh, it is fantastic. And then just a little bit of pretty there. This is a really satisfying soup. If you've ever tried a soup made with any squash or other gourd, such as butternut squash soup or acorn squash soup, this is extremely palate pleasing and also pleasant to the eye. I mean, Jiminy Christmas, look at the color you have there. That's gorgeous. That'll work great on any holiday table. And honestly, goes pretty well with turkey. Anyway, this has been Chef Jerry for Delicious Dishes. Hope you have a great day and bon appetit.
Thank you.